Hi everyone. So as Dr. Welter said, I'm Molly Kaptein, and today I'm talking about the importance of battling compassion fatigue. As Ebola cases accelerate, Liberia's sick must fend for themselves. 2 years after war broke out in Ukraine, the death toll continues to mount. ISIS forces civilians to be human shields in Mosul. Easter bombing near church in Nigeria kills 38. South Sudan civil war causes Africa's worst refugee crisis. Iran-Iraq earthquake kills more than 500. 4 people in Florida have Zika. Worryingly, it may not have come from traveling. Myanmar follows global pattern in how ethnic cleansing begins. So, as I read these 8 headlines that have happened over the past 3 years, what was your thought process? I read these headlines pretty quickly, so likely you didn't really even have time to think about the words I was saying as they're coming out of my mouth. Or what I was saying, let alone have any feeling of compassion for the tremendous amount of suffering that has gone on in the past 3 years. So, though this is obviously not exactly how compassion fatigue nor the news works, what I'm trying to say is that the constant influx of increasingly worse news makes it nearly impossible to connect a feeling of compassion with the suffering of the distant other. So, what exactly is compassion fatigue? As defined by Susan Moeller, a professor of journalism at the University of Maryland, compassion fatigue is an indifference to charitable appeals on behalf of those who are suffering, experienced as a result of the frequency of such appeals. In other words, people become desensitized and apathetic to the suffering of others in a setting where the bad news constantly streams through. So, I first became acquainted with this topic my freshman year at Biola in my Foundations of Journalism class with Dr. Longano. I took that class my very first semester and was wildly intimidated, but I do remember we had these newspaper reading assignments that we did every week. And I remember Ebola being in the news always. There were several articles each newspaper, 1, 2, 5, who knows. But I also remember when Ebola stopped being reported on. I remember when people stopped talking about it, the general public kind of stopped caring about it, and then it faded from memory. So what happened? Obviously, Ebola continued to be an epidemic in West Africa. Obviously, Ebola is still having a huge effect on that population 3 years later. So what happened to it in the news? The following semester, I was able to continue thinking about this topic through a research paper and just asking the questions, why does this happen? Why does the news report like this? And what should we do about it? So, though I began researching this topic out of a strong aversion to apathy, it soon grew into an actual passion for compassion. So that same semester that I wrote that paper about compassion fatigue, I also found myself with a growing passion for missions and a passion for the nations. I'd gone to missions conference for the first time as a freshman at Biola, and I remember hearing missions talked about in a way that I never had before. And I remember hearing about the Great Commission and the Father's heart for the world in a way that had never been presented to me. So I had this growing passion knowing that the Lord had put a lot of things on my heart previous to that were leading me into a potential future in missions. But as I also discovered that passion, I came to realize that I didn't have a strong compassion for any particular group of people. I didn't have a strong brokenness for the lost, and my heart wasn't seriously burdened for those who are suffering. So this distressed me because I was like, how am I supposed to go into a future of missions and continue as a journalist if I don't even care about the people who are suffering? So I talked to one of my good friends who is involved with Youth with a Mission about this, and she told me about her beginning with the topic of compassion and how she prayed that the Lord would give her an extra measure of compassion. So that year in my freshman year dorm room, I said, Lord, give me a bit of your Father's heart to see the broken as you see them and see the lost as you see them. Give me an extra measure of compassion. So the Lord continually grew this passion in me in these past 3 years, and it started particularly in regards to the refugee crisis of the Middle East. But I'll get back to that soon. So, what exactly does it mean to be a person of compassion? Literally, compassion means to suffer with. So often in our culture and in our society, we talk about compassion as pity. They're the same thing when we talk about it. Oh, I feel bad for what happened the other day. You're such a compassionate person. Oh, I feel so sad for that bad news story that just came up. Oh, you're so compassionate. But if compassion means to suffer with, we're missing something. We are not suffering with people if we simply feel sorry for someone. To have compassion comes at a cost to ourselves. So Jesus was the ultimate compassionate person, and obviously that came at a serious cost to him. Jesus reached out and touched leprers, and he ate with prostitutes, and one of his best friends was a tax collector. He stopped on the side of the road for the deaf and for the blind. And if we're Christians, and if we are following Christ as we are meant to, then we will also be people of compassion. For me, leaning into the suffering of others and having compassion came in 3 different ways. First, as I studied it in international journalism with Dr. Welter. Second, as I had the chance to inform others by participating in missions conference for myself. And then third, as I engaged this crisis face-to-face in my internship with Voice of the Refugees and a mission trip to Croatia doing refugee ministry this past summer. So first, studying it. Studying in international journalism, we had a content analysis project, and in that project, I analyzed how refugees were portrayed in the media. And this was all in regards to this photo of a 2-year-old Syrian boy who, as he was crossing the Mediterranean with his family, drowned, along with his brother and his mother. So this photo was published in the news, and many of you might remember it, but it caused a pretty big stir because death isn't typically published in photos on the front page of the newspaper, particularly when it's a 2-year-old boy. So I was wondering, how did the media change their portrayal of refugees based on this thing that would evoke so much emotion in most people? So though I recognized a change in how the media portrayed refugees, I began to wonder, well, how are people still responding to this change that we've seen occur in photojournalism? So second, I got the chance to inform other people about this topic through missions conference. I was on the Global Awareness Missions Conference staff, and we got the chance to talk about the least of these, one of those groups being refugees. So as I had this growing passion and compassion for refugees, part of my heart's desire was to also see other people have that same passion and see other people have compassion for a group of people that the Lord loves so deeply. And then thirdly, and most significantly, I engaged in this crisis face-to-face and hope to see my compassion grow in my internship with Voice of the Refugees this summer, as well as the refugee ministry I did abroad. So as I was there, I got to know people like Mohammed and Azar and Hassoni, and I got to meet people who were professors and people who were doctors, people who had homes left behind in Iraq or Syria, people who talked about the streets they used to walk along in Damascus, and I got to know people who had lost their national identities as they'd been forced from their homes. And I got to know people who were continuing to have their identity marred as they were in a country that might not really welcome them. So, as I expected a growing compassion to come from this interaction face-to-face, from these relationships I had grown, from these people that I knew and loved so deeply, as I was preparing for this presentation and thinking about my history with this topic, and just thinking through my past season in Croatia and during my internship, I began to realize that I, ironically, am in my own state of compassion fatigue. I've been so engaged with these people and love them so dearly, but here I am coming out of it and I'm just completely dry, and I'm so empty with nothing left to give. So continually, as I prepared for this, I began to think about my history with the topic. I began to think about my beginnings and how for me, it started with a prayer that the Lord would give me his heart, because it's not my natural heart by any means. So, this brings me to what I've learned about compassion fatigue over my time at Biola. If we have any hopes of fighting compassion fatigue for anyone else, we must first fight it in our own hearts. So I think there are two ways to do this as we think about our own hearts and as we think about the hearts of others. As I've titled my presentation, Eyes to See, Ears to Hear, and as I mentioned, the heart that I had prayed for from the Lord, only Jesus can really give us eyes to see and ears to hear those who are suffering. Only Jesus can really give us eyes to see the lost and the sufferers and the broken and the weary as he sees them. Only Jesus can give us ears to hear the stories of suffering as he does. So, if we're going to be in an industry that is so engaged with suffering, that enters into suffering as they talk with those who are in the midst of it, as well as telling it to those who are hearing about it daily, then we must first rely on the Lord to give us that heart of compassion, those eyes to see and those ears to hear. The second way I believe we can combat this is to tell stories of hope. Stories that have a glimmer of hope, a thread woven into them that tell of something greater. So I've seen this done well in two places, and I'm sure many more do it. But the first is Solutions Journalism Network. And Solutions Journalism is actually a movement that is coming about in the journalism industry that focuses on what's actually happening, the truth of the suffering, the truth of the story, but it also talks about here are solutions that are being done. Here's what's working, here's what's not working, here's people who are doing something about it. So if you read this headline, it says Rohingya women and girls fleeing rape find solace in safe places. Just from the headline, there is a glimmer of hope. And then the second place I have seen this hope deeply woven into the stories is through Nations Foundation. Nations Foundation is an organization in Carlsbad, and they're a biannual print magazine. I have the honor of interning with Nations next semester, and I initially reached out to them knowing that they have strong echoes of hope in their stories, and this is the kind of journalist I want to be. These are the kind of journalists I want to learn from, and these are the kind of journalists that I want to watch what they do and implement that in whatever I do in the future. So, I believe this is why we need Christian journalists in the industry. We need people who have hope for themselves. We need people that are reliant on the hope that Jesus has given us, the only true hope that we really have, if we're going to share the bad news of this world constantly. So, as Christians with this true hope, knowing that death has been defeated already as we engage in this suffering, but if we also know that death has been defeated and we know that most of the world is living in a lie that they continue to believe with each tragic headline that comes to the front page of the newspaper, then our obligation is clear. Our obligation is to fight that lie with the hope that we are so sure to be true. So this concludes my presentation, and I would love to answer any questions you might have about the topic of compassion fatigue.